And then it says, great. Yeah.
You take 18th, right? Sports Arena Boulevard.
Yes.
I remember going to that street many days ago.
Yeah.
To the Sears outlet.
Sears outlet?
There's a Sears outlet there.
Where? Marina Boulevard?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought there were peas in here, but it's green chips.
Oh, really? Green chips?
I thought it was like
This is spicy, salty and spicy. I like the,
this looked like a wasabi
What are they?
thingy to me.
What's it called?
no idea, Indian stuff.
It's like a spinach fritter, right?
Oh, is it
like
spinach?
fried stuff. Onion rings type. Instead of onion, there's some other stuff.
I'll try one.
Other stuff.
Nice.
Other stuff.
Healthy stuff.
That's good.
Vegan cookies.
Okay. We'll see. Yeah, thank you.
Do you know if that's reflecting?
Hi.
How you doing?
Good.
Nice weather.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
very nice. Nice to be out here in the sun.
Gonna have a little bit of sun.
Build up your vitamin D.
Yeah.
Warmed your butt up. The chair was really warm when I sat in it. Go ahead.
Sometimes I wonder how this group keeps going because I don't, they don't request donations. And I want to know how they keep this organization going.
There's a donation box there. People
I
put
know,
there.
but I,
So, and then the budget
Yeah.
got into hard
Their
it's not
principle
like
is
a
not
church
to
where they
ask.
collect
Not
every
to ask.
service.
I gaslight with that. Yeah.
Do you come often here?
Not too often. I usually look for interesting
Right.
discussions because I already know a lot of this information.
Uh-huh.
This talk is so general.
Yeah.
You could ask a lot of detailed questions that would go way
Most
beyond
people who are here, they've already gone through that.
Yeah.
So, but still she's connecting to the practical world.
Rid of it. No, is that another word for killing it? The garden has
Yeah, she keeps it on a very physical level. I mean, stress and the body.
I have no idea what a garden
But Vedanta, of course, goes much deeper than that.
You have a lawn?
I would hope when she talks about
I when I bought a house, she has grass around the
talk
back.
about dealing with emotions, not like transcending them, but they're going to always be there. They're never going to, they're part and parcel, at least I think, part of what we are. And we need to be educated as to how to deal with them in a positive way.
But to me, that's not transcending. That's just managing. I don't like that word transcending because it means something different.
I don't think it's time. I mean,
Not the way she's talking.
educating them in golf course instead of Instead of emotions coming out of violence or stuffing them, unhealthy.
So funny, there's a lot of churches that do that. And they're starting baby season. Oh, so the boys are all off in their show, chasing all the girls around.
South of
Dalai Lama is very active.
Yeah, he's very, he emphasizes compassion.
His care, yes,
Right,
well, mindfulness is part of
But see, that's just it. She doesn't distinguish between mindfulness and witnessing. They're different. You can't be mindful and sleep, but you can witness your sleep. So she's not making a distinction. She's glossing over a lot of stuff. I don't consider happiness a condition.
But you know, a lot of times we get stuck in language because some people call it,
I've never seen
in
people
Vedanta
do
they
that.
call happiness, they call it joy.
She already got yelled
It's
at.
not very
We have
precise.
to establish a linguistic connection first, so we know that we may be using different words.
Yeah, I think she knows a lot. Yeah.
So you ready to,
Part two. Yeah, look forward.
ready to go for enlightenment? Or you already enlightened? Well, you probably heard some of this. You heard some of this stuff.
That veggie concoction, I never had it before, it was delicious.
It was. Spicy.
Really? Yeah, maybe.
There should be something there.
There are two bathrooms. One bathroom is right here, and another one in the room.
How are you? How's your parents?
Maybe I'll give you a handshake another day, Dave.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still there. Yeah, it's just, on one little wing there.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, that's where my office is.
Thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
You just spent a lot of time and effort to do this.
You
I put my earphones on and listen and.
Actually, I had your spelling wrong. Instead of first time, I didn't put Richards. So it came back. Then I thought about it. I said, what am I doing wrong? So that S was missing.
Oh, good, good. I tried to write it clearly. It's long.
No, you told that. I mean, your name was written right, but when I was writing the email, I forgot the S. So
I like those Ram ones too. The man that sings the Ram. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right,
Yeah.
the meditation one.
They're beautiful.
And I haven't sent that. Maybe I did send the other one. The one you talked about, the 3 pictures. So I made a video on it.
No, you're gonna send me that one now.
It's on my site, actually, if you go to.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Almost 35 years. Yeah. We, as a matter of fact, I came before we bought this place. Not founders, but I go back a long time, yeah.
I know, right?
It's a friend of mine who said, you know, I went to some meeting, and it's very interesting. She said, you wanna come?
Shouting a lot, or, just feeling, overwhelmed or anxious. And then, of course, cynicism or negativity. These are all signs that you're accumulating emotional toxicity. You're not processing and dealing and moving this emotional energy. And so ultimately, what can happen is what we call emotional ama. Ama is a word for toxicity in Ayurveda, so it can represent physical toxicity, ama, in the body. It accumulates and it clogs up channels. Or it can be emotional ama, that's clogging up channels of flow of prana, going back to that very first slide. So when we have some sort of emotional, again, pain or struggle, based on something that we think we wanted or didn't want, that happened from the ego mind, it becomes stored in your body. And then that's why we have these buttons, right? And so it can show up again depending on your dosha or your mind-body type as anxiety, hostility, or guilt. Guilt is really just hostility directed inward, so sometimes when we talk about fiery types, and we joke sometimes like, what did you do wrong? Sometimes they're the worst critics of themselves, and that can create a lot of guilt, but it's really one and the same. And then of course depression, that heavy, sad energy that doesn't get processed shows up as depression. So again, I think we would all agree that, when we move through the world with this emotional ama, it's a struggle, right? And what we want to do is get to, no matter what happens in our life, to experience it not as a struggle. Okay, next slide. So what happens when we feel that struggle or stress? Stress is just another word, that we throw around. And really from our perspective, we consider stress anything that's obstructing the flow of consciousness in your body. It can be physical or it can be emotional. Because when we are in pure awareness, we don't feel stress, right? And when we do feel stress, again, whether it's from something physical that happens to us, which is really what the stress response is for in the body, or whether it's emotional, we go through these biological responses in the body. And so I'm going to go through them just to give you a picture of what happens when we start to move out of the letters, are like the more tamasic, physical, biological and emotional responses of fight or flight or freeze. The reactive fight or flight, which I'm going to talk about those. Those are where we get stuck, right? Tamas represents inertia. So most people are functioning from these two levels of awareness, these biological and emotional responses. And they do correlate in Vedanta and Vedic philosophy to different levels of awareness in your, spiritually. So when most people, again, are just mindlessly going through life, and so their reactions or how they deal with life is always going to be in stress mode, fight, flight, reactive, tamasic, right? Restful awareness is meditation or mindfulness, anything that brings us into the present moment. It can be pranayama, it can be many tools, which we'll talk about, but our main tool is meditation. And what that does, again, when we directly experience restful awareness, it's called turiya also, is just pure awareness. And really, how we describe it is that's the doorway to higher emotional and biological responses in the body, and ultimately, spiritually, higher levels of awareness. So we start to become more intuitive, creative, visionary, and we start to become enlightened, or samadhi is, kind of how it progresses or evolves. So let's talk about, again, with the next slide, we'll talk about fight, flight, or freeze. So again, fight or flight is the nervous system that gets activated when we feel like we're under a threat, okay? And it is a normal, primitive biological response that's in all animals, right? We call that the reptilian brain. The most primitive part of our brain, and this is where I'm going to go into the science a little bit, is the red part, the reptilian brain. It's for our basic physical survival. So if there's a loud noise, we jump, right? Or, if we're not fed, we have this desire to eat because we don't want to die, right? And so this is we see all the way from reptiles and, creatures all the way up to humans. We have this survival mechanism, and it's important. So it's not that this is bad, but we want to use it and properly, like when really the house is on fire and we need this, fight or flight response to actually run, or when we are under threat and we need perhaps in times past to fight. Also freeze is another, it's a stress response that some people have, and in biology a lot of animals do use this. If they hear a noise, it could be a predator, to freeze and not move, right? So this is for safety, and it's based on, again, a fear of not surviving. And so again, we need to understand that this stress response in the body can also get activated when we're struggling with our emotions. It's the same biology as when we're actually trying to run out of a building because it's on fire. And in times past in humanity, these threats actually used to be more physical. So that's why people were in fight or flight a lot of the time, but we also didn't live very long. And there was this constant kind of struggle. And now that most of our physical needs are met, and again, there are people in the world, unfortunately, that still exist in environments where there's real true physical danger to their lives. But for the most part, for probably most of us, we have our physical needs met. And now it's the emotional body that drives that stress response. So the next slide, we call it the reactive or ego response, is more about the emotions, right? So we call it the psychological fight or flight. We feel threatened by something that happened in our life, or we feel threatened by something somebody said, and so we argue. Or again, I want to deal with it, I'm shutting down, I don't want to have that conversation, I'm withdrawing. None of those are particularly, they're all still a little bit dysfunctional, and especially, again, a big source of stress for people is relationship. So we feel a struggle in relationship, and instead of sitting down and, really consciously communicating, which we'll talk a little bit about, we bark at each other, or we don't deal with it and we run away, or, again, we zone out, right, like she's doing there. And this is just, again, the psychological version of stress response. So the next slide goes into, again, this stress response is really coming from a place of fear. So when we start to examine our thoughts, fear is always coming from ego mind, right? So there's some fear. If you can identify what is it that I'm afraid of in this interaction, what am I afraid of? It could be many, I just listed a few things. Like, am I afraid of being rejected or criticized? Am I afraid of not being accepted or not being loved? Am I afraid of the unknown? Maybe I have a conversation with someone about, getting a new job or something, and I have this stress response to it because I'm afraid of the unknown. And again, coming from a place of pure consciousness, we don't have fear, right? We welcome challenges and opportunities in our lives. Am I afraid of changing old habits? Who would I be if I don't think this way? I've thought this way for 80 years or however long, 50 years, 40 years, 10 years. Who am I if I give that up, right? And believe it or not, these are things that the ego mind comes up with. The mind's a very creative engine. And, so we have all these fears, losing my image. If I don't have that job, what will people say about me? That's all ego, right? It's all ego mind. And again, not to judge ego, they're good questions, right? So we want to examine the questions. What will people think of me? Well, let me think about that from a space of consciousness. They may think I'm doing something that I really want to do. And, if they don't like it, that may be their issue to deal with, not mine, right? So, examine where those ego thoughts are coming from. Because that always constricts and limits us. Sometimes we think we're protecting ourselves with these ego thoughts, but they really just constrict and limit our spiritual development as well, right? And it also, by the way, creates a harmful physiology. It induces the stress response in the body. So what the stress response looks like, and this is why, next slide, click a few more times so that the other bullets show up. This is why, again, when we don't process emotions, I think that's all, and why in Ayurveda, and when we sit down and really dive down into people's histories, a lot of times they think, and we do talk about their food they're eating and, you know, their level of activity and exercise, but I really dive deep into what's going on in the emotional, in the mind, because that can be the root cause of many physical ailments, because when there's emotional stress, all of these things happen. And this is stress response in the body. It helps us with immediate survival, blood pressure going up, digestion getting, you know, blood shunting from digestion to muscles that we need to like run away. When we're truly in threat, this is okay. The immune system doesn't work as properly. Our platelets get stickier, which leads to clots and, you know, heart attacks and strokes and things. So obviously this is not a physiology for long-term health and longevity, right? And so that's why, again, in Ayurveda, there's a couple of interpretations. We say Ayurveda Amritanam. So Ayurveda is for immortality. Again, not necessarily, it does help us live a longer quality of life, and quantity and quality, both. But it's not so that our physical body becomes immortal. Ayurveda is also, again, looking at what's keeping us from coming from a place of consciousness so that we can experience our immortal selves in every moment. So that's really the true interpretation. So, next slide. So again, all of those changes in physiology. So just think about that when you're feeling like super emotional and you have that stuck feeling in your body, it's creating, not to put fear into you, but it is creating a physiology that can lead to chronic illness. So anyone who has a chronic illness, it is important to look at the emotional body. What's going on in that emotional part of you, because it could be impacting you. In fact, a lot of arrhythmias, there's a lot of research on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the electricity and the electromagnetic field around the heart. How our heart beats is electrical, right? And so when we have some sort of severe emotional experience, it can create arrhythmias. So especially when people have, meaning your heart starts to beat differently and funny and not in a coherent, synchronized way, a lot of times there's some really emotional cause there. And again, same with everything, digestive disturbances, autoimmune diseases, many of the things, diabetes, heart disease, many of the chronic illnesses. Okay, next slide. So again, this slide I found interesting because it does correlate somewhat to loosely. Again, I'm always trying to figure out what modern psychology and science is finding and how that reflects what Ayurveda and Vedic philosophy says. So this fight, flight, or freeze, loosely, the Vata and Kapha descriptions could be mixed up a little bit, but you know, people who tend to be more fighters, irritable, losing their temper, defensive, that's Pitta getting out of balance. That's that fiery type. And then anxiety and fear for sure is that Vata reaction to life experience. You know, whenever there's something new, they get a little bit anxious and fearful. And then Kapha is more the whatever, I don't care, I'm not going to deal with it, more the freeze. Sometimes, again, Vata and Kapha qualities can look a little bit interchangeable. But again, these are defense mechanisms. Again, there's something that's creating a fear in us, and we have an opportunity to look at that as opposed to running away from it or dysfunctionally dealing with it.